Hello, this is John Williams of Bulletproof Integrity. I'd like to talk to you about the answer to a question that many of my clients ask me. Why am I involved with these sex-related habits? Why do I have a sex addiction? Why do I have a pornography addiction? And it turns out the answer is multifaceted, and some of which are really below the surface, and that's why they're even harder to understand. Let me draw your attention to this diagram on my site. It shows the many different factors that are involved. Some of them are, as you can see on the left side, inherent and inherited. These are things that you received basically from birth or young. And environmental represents the other half. So more than half, as you'll notice, is about 55%, is inherent and inherited. And then about 45% is environmental. That is, it's circumstances around us. You'll notice that virtually all of these factors are beyond your control at this point. In other words, they were either things you were born with or things that you were subjected to quite young. Some of the factors we can do something about now, and certainly we can undo the damage and undo the effects of a lot of these factors. But I'm just pointing out that it just wants you to notice that a lot of the things that are affecting you now came from either before you were born or when you were quite young. And so don't blame yourself. That's the key point. Don't personalize it. So let's talk about this. On the left-hand side, rather, let's go over these points. In the inherent and inherited category are your personality traits. You may have been born with a certain type of personality that's very emotional, very sensitive. You may be very, and this brings in also sensitivities, which is on the bottom of the chart. You may have been born with a certain type of sensual quality. You're very responsive to touch more than others. You're very responsive to your senses. You experience your senses very potently in ways that others do not. And so if for that reason, the overwhelmingly powerful experience of orgasm and that kind of thing just pulls you maybe more than others, or you're more sensitive to being touched than others, and this could influence your susceptibility to this particular type of habit. Your personality trait may be such that you are naturally shy, withdrawn, had a hard time getting your needs met socially. There can be many factors that are involved, but especially a certain emotional sensitivity I find is quite common. Many of the people that I see that are addicted, they are naturally very empathetic, and so they're more easily hurt than others. On two levels. On one hand, they can feel other people's hearts and they can feel other people's situations, and they want emotional connection. And when someone cuts them off, they are particularly stung by that, maybe more than other people. On the other hand, they also, because they can feel other people's emotional suffering more than many, they are distressed by the suffering of others. So, for example, as in my case, when I was a boy, my mother was depressed, because I'm a sensitive guy, I could feel her sadness and distress so potently all day long, and yet there was nothing I could do about it. So I was distressed and suffocated by her suffering in a way that didn't do me any good. So this might apply to you too, that you're just simply, you take in more than other people. You're more distressed by things than others. You're more hurt by bad experiences than others because you're so sensitive. This is a strength in terms of creativity. This is a strength in terms of your ability to love others. This is a strength in terms of your ability to emotionally connect with people and understand what they feel and what they need. This is a great boon in many ways, but it also makes you more susceptible to this type of addiction. And then again on this side is ancestral patterns, that you might have more, you might have inherited things from your ancestors. For example, there could be incest, there could be infidelity, sexual problems, sexual addiction in your grandparents, your great-grandparents. There could be patterns of abusing women or misusing children, things like that in your history that you don't even know about. One of the most interesting things I ever read was that in the 90s, people who had been involved with adultery in their marriage, either the adulterer or the victim, the innocent spouse. Um, Researchers were allowed to go and talk to their parents. Now, at this point, the parents were elderly. These were adults we're talking about, elderly parents. They interviewed the parents and they discovered that in about 9 out of 10 cases, one of at least one of the spouses involved in an adultery and in an affair in their adult marriage had parents with an affair as well. Often this adult child had never heard about it because naturally the parents had covered it up when they were growing up. So in other words, about 9 out of 10 of couples involved in infidelity, at least one of the spouses, often unknowingly, had parents involved with infidelity too. And we can imagine that this infidelity in the parents' marriage, that the child may very well have picked it up by osmosis and picked up either some sense that adultery is natural, something like that. Who knows? All I'm saying is that there's inherited patterns that may be influencing you, as well as your personality and sensitivity. That's about 55% of it. 45% tends to be environmental, according to what people have figured out. So we'll look at some of these things, like the age of first exposure to sex. It is an absolute kind of child abuse to have a child 10 years old suddenly online being exposed to adults having intercourse or doing all kinds of very jarring things on screen, when a child has no way to process this, has no way to understand it. He doesn't even know what sex is, let alone sex between these strangers. And it's just very traumatic for a child to be exposed to sex, to pornography, to strange behavior from their babysitter, from their parents. All of this can be quite disturbing to the young nervous system. And so the age of first exposure is a strong factor in how a person could develop a habit. Causes anxiety, and then they feel drawn to it. They're repelled by it, but they're drawn to it. They're aroused by it. They hate it. It's very complicated. So many of my clients were exposed to pornography at the age of 12, 13, and nowadays it's more like 9, 10. And this sets people up for having a potential problem the whole life. There's a sexualized culture around us that constantly talks about sex outside of marriage, outside of commitment, outside even affection, and just acts like it's nothing. How can young people not be influenced by a culture that constantly talks about how great sex is, no matter who it's with, and that all the beautiful people are having sex with whomever they want? This is what we see on screens. How could they not be influenced toward this as a kind of drug of choice if they have some susceptibility to abuse something that gives pleasure? Family issues, many times the way that our fathers and mothers talked about sex, flirting and being racy, or maybe walking around half nude, these things influence us. And family issues around sex, that it was forbidden to be talked about, or that it was openly flaunted, that your father made or mother made lewd comments, that people made comments about your body, people made comments about your genitals. When young people grow up in a family where it's clear that sex and the sexual parts of the body are like a really important, if unspoken thing. If people are making comments about your body, like to a boy, you're looking sexy, you're looking hunky, buff, or I wonder, if the girls are really going to like, your crotch, or or girls being talked about their breasts or their bodies or their butt, or this kind of thing is just very disorienting to a kid. And so this can be quite destructive. Family issues then around sex can clearly set you up for a sex addiction. Trauma. Talked about sex. I kind of implied sex abuse, or being molested, or being the target of unwanted sexual attention as a kind of trauma, abuse. Many kinds of trauma exist. And a lot of times the trauma is so common that we don't think of it as trauma at all. But it turns out that according to research, we now understand, the same way we now understand that childhood concussions, falling off your bike, butting your head with a soccer ball one too many times, We now know that childhood concussion can cause lasting brain damage and affect your entire life, so that many things you didn't attribute to that, like math problems, are in fact caused by this kind of childhood wound. In the same way, many of us are emotionally or otherwise traumatized, and we would never think of it as being a source of our pain and the kind of addiction we have now. But we now know that the death of a parent, divorce, which is so common, is traumatic to a kid. Having people be abusive to you, having adults not care about you, feeling as if your family doesn't really care about one another. If you stack up a few of these things at once, then it really becomes traumatic. Let me just draw your attention to another slide on my site that I think you'll find interesting. We can look at this one, bad childhood experiences and how they affect childhood. Let me just bring your attention to that slide. Okay. So, for example, this is again on the site. We now know that if you have 4 or more childhood experiences that were really difficult, that such individuals, when they grow up to be adults, are 11 times more likely to inject drugs like heroin. 11 times more likely. 7 times more likely to be alcoholic. 2.5 more times likely to be sexually promiscuous. 3.5 times more likely to be depressed. 2.5 times more likely to have constant anxiety, and so on. Twice as likely to smoke or to be overeating. So again, I just want to make you aware of this, that it turns out that it isn't so much fun to be, having these experiences, however common they may be. It's not fun, and it's not harmless. I've had clients who said, golly, having a father who left our family, having our parents divorced, having relatives who constantly called me names and sort of abused me or hit me, feeling uncared about, having someone give me unwanted sexual attention as a child. This was quite common where they grew up. Having a lot of difficulties was so common, they don't even think about it. But now they find themselves doing mysterious things sexually that they really can't understand. So again, I just want to give you a sense. And by the way, the last factor was emotional neglect. And this is often the biggest, most unnoticed problem. Emotional neglect means that when you were growing up, your parents were so preoccupied. They were doing their best, but they were often so preoccupied, working 2 jobs, maybe dealing with a divorce, dealing with a death, dealing with an illness. And they didn't mean any harm, but when the key point was that when you were growing up, you often were emotionally neglected. You would come home from school experiencing distress over something, and there was nobody there even to notice. And you would have needs, you would be sad, lonely, scared, and nobody noticed, nobody cared. And you start getting the impression that my needs are not important, I shouldn't have any needs, I don't want to bother anybody. When parents are not responsive to us, we naturally think it's our fault. And all of this can lead to lifetime patterns of lack of self-discipline, lack of emotional awareness, the inability to make friends, not knowing how to soothe yourself except through something like sex or pornography. So a lot of these things are there from the childhood. Good news is we can change things. We can improve things, we can undo the damage. But knowing these factors, again, has the main benefit of getting you to stop blaming yourself for being mystified. And now that then you can just stop, punishing yourself with guilt and blame, and start focusing, okay, how can I undo this? How can I learn the skills I need? How can I get the love and care and attention I need? How can I develop self-awareness? How can I develop healthy habits to offset what I've been doing? And how can I quit porn, quit my sex habit, and have the kind of freedom, self-respect, and power that I long for? This is what I'm here to help you do. Please check out my site, Bulletproof Integrity, and investigate. And I'll be happy to have a free consultation with you to talk about strategies to help you overcome your habit. Hope you found this interesting. Thanks.